Alright guys, so last time in my last video I talked about adverbs and adjectives and why they're a rule, and maybe not everybody who's watched this has watched that video, and that's fine, but you're familiar with the rule about why we shouldn't use adverbs and should use adjectives sparingly. I'm going to talk about how to break that rule and when you should break it. So the first reason is that the verb you need doesn't exist, or the noun itself by default doesn't imply what you mean. So in my last video I used the word pulled hard, and I explained how that could be replaced with the verb yanked, which is a stronger verb. Now, that doesn't work for every situation, right? So sure, we can replace pulled hard with yanked, but our language lacks in other areas. And I've run into this problem several times in writing, and unfortunately, like at the moment, I can't think of an exact example that I've been through, but it happens. So I'll use a poor example just to illustrate. So just go with it. So like, is there a verb that means to fish sneakily? Like you're sneaking around, you're fishing, to fish sneakily. No, there's not a word for that. So if knowing that your character's fishing is being done in a sneaky way, if that's important to your story or the image you're creating, then you can go ahead and use it, right? It's similar with adjectives and nouns. So I once read an article about adjectives that referred to a poem about blueberries, for example. And one part of the poem describes this girl's apron heavy and stained from blueberries, and the author of this article asked whether the writer of this poem, the poet, should use the adjective azure, or use blue. And the answer was no, you don't need to use that adjective because it's describing stains. Like, if you're using the word azure to describe these stains, it sounds like you're trying too hard to be poetic. Anyway, so as I read this article, I thought about it, and I saw something else to this argument. So at first I thought, well, maybe the poet wanted to specify what kind of blue to his readers, right? And then I realized that blueberries are only so many different kinds of blue, and the average person knows what kind of blue blueberries are. So you don't need to add, you don't need to say blue blueberries or azure blueberries, whatever. The reader is already familiar with blueberries. They know what colors they are. It's like modifying, sun with yellow again. Now, that said, not every noun has like a default color. So coats, for example, they come in lots of different colors. And if the coat is important to your character, you might want your reader to know what color it is. So just tell us the color. You can just say she wore a red coat, right? So remember, the modifier itself should have a purpose for being there. So if the verb or noun cannot imply its modifier on its own, right? Blueberries, we know they're always blue. We know what kind of blue they are. We don't need to say coats. We don't know necessarily what color they are because they come in so many. Then you can use a modifier, right? So then you can use adverbs or adjectives. Okay, the second reason is to keep the right pacing, okay? So another alternative to adverbs and adjectives is to show us the modifier, like I've talked about before. So if we look at this example, I walk to the dark wings of the stage. So there's the word dark, right? Is there a word that means dark and wing? No. So you could argue that wings are usually dark on a stage, but maybe this isn't during a performance. Your character's on stage helping build the set pieces. All the lights are on, but there are still some wings that are still dark despite that. So maybe you would want to write it like this if you wanted to show it. I walk to the wing of the stage. Shadows sleep between the curtains on ropes and now on me. As I go deeper into one wing, I can't see my feet. So do you see how I show that it's dark? You see how much stronger that writing is? So this example would be perfectly fine to use. Unless this part of the story needs faster pacing, right? That's the point of this element, number 2. Second reason to break it. So when you show things, showing slows things down. Showing everything slows things down. It slows the pacing of your story. So if you need to kick up the pacing, but it's important for the reader to know that the wings are dark, then all means just use the modifier, right? Now there's another way to show dark that you could consider. You could try using a quick simile or a metaphor, right? So here is that revamped. I walk to the wing of the stage, the jaws of some animal that's chewing the night. When you use similes and metaphors, you imply other things between the lines in the subtext. By saying that the wings of the stage are like the jaws of an animal, the writer implies something negative about the place and its effect on our character, right? And you could go into that more. So when you're using comparisons, they can carry more meaning that way too. But with all that said, while the metaphor provides faster pacing than my earlier example, it's still not as fast as just saying, I walk to the dark wings of the stage. Done. So if you need that pacing, then go ahead and use those modifiers. Okay, third way to break this. The modifier is unusual or makes the situation interesting, right? We don't want to just say something that is just like, okay, oh, the sun's yellow. We don't need that. But if you can find adverbs and adjectives that have like a surprising turn to what you're describing, they make it interesting, then great, So let's go back to an example I used before. Get your butt in your room right now, Cynthia said. Now, we don't need to add angrily to the end of it. But what if Cynthia isn't saying these words in an angry way, right? What if she's trying to be kind of seductive? I don't know. She seems kind of like a crazy person. So then it would be fine to write, get your butt in your room right now, Cynthia said seductively. Because if you see in that example, the dialogue itself carries a different kind of tone than the way she's actually saying it. So we need that adverb there to explain it. It immediately changes, it has this twist to it, immediately changes things. So in a story that I'm working on, I have a character who tends to say negative things with a cheerful demeanor. And he says negative things when he's joking around, but I need to clue the reader into that. So when my character says something like, oh, Sarah's the worst, he isn't saying it in a pessimistic way. He's actually fascinated by that fact, about how bad she is. So instead I would write, Sarah's the worst, Scott said cheerfully. So again, you can show that cheerfulness through the scene to provide context, but that takes up space and that slows pacing. So you could use a similar metaphor, right? So I could say, Sarah's the worst, Scott said, like he'd paid her a compliment. So use adjectives the same way. When people smile, we assume that they're happy, but that's not always the case. Use adjectives when there are exceptions, right? So here's an example. When her assistant walked in, Elise gave him a smile. It's like, okay, that sounds fine, but listen to this one. When her assistant walked in, Elise gave him a cold smile, right? That's interesting. It adds depth to what's going on. That's the thing about using these adjectives and adverbs, things that are surprising, is it adds depth, it adds subtext and meaning to what's there. Okay, 4. Use modifiers to create tone and character voice. When you want to create a certain type of character, when you want to create a certain type of character voice or tone, you may want to use some kind of surprising language or turns of phrases, things like that. Alright, so here's a really good example of that. That comes from The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. And this is just a passage from it. And pay attention to how his choice of using adverbs and adjectives helps create the tone and the character's voice of the story. So here's how it went in God's heart. The 6 or 7 or 10 of us walked or willed in, grazed at a decrepit selection of cookies and lemonade, sat down in the circle of trust, and listened to Patrick recount for the 1000th time his depressingly miserable life story, how he had cancer and they thought he was going to die, but he didn't die, and now here he is, a full-grown adult in a church basement on the 137th nicest city in America, divorced, addicted to video games, mostly friendless, eking out a meager living by exploiting his cancer-tastic past, slowly working his way towards a master's degree that will not improve his career prospects. So you can see how Green uses those adjectives and adverbs to create a kind of dark, humorous tone, right? If you cut them out, then the passage is going to have a very different feeling. In most sentences, you wouldn't want to say like depressingly miserable. It's redundant, right? Depression is miserable. If you actually wanted to make the reader feel depressingly miserable, you'd show them what that's like. But Green doesn't want us to make us feel that way. He's using the adverb and adjective to create a kind of dark humor charm to it. It implies and does exactly what Patrick is doing, making something sound more depressing or miserable than the narrator thinks it is. And the phrase full-grown adult, all adults are full-grown, right? That's what it means to be an adult. But the emphasis by saying full-grown adult pokes fun at Patrick for that. There's also a good example in Half-Blood Prince, one of the Harry Potter books. When Harry takes the Felix potion, the tone changes. It's very entertaining. You could also look at that for more of these things. Number 5, okay? I kind of touched on this a little bit, but 5, the adjective or adverb is doing double duty. It's doing more than what it's just saying. So if you have one that's very telling, not in the show tell versus away, but in the sense that it says more than what it's saying, it's cluing us into something, then you can use it. So here's an example. He wore a sharp white shirt and red power tie, but his watch was plastic. His cologne a scent sold in supermarkets. So in my sentence, sharp white shirt and red tie, it's contrasting with plastic watch and supermarket cologne. So the modifiers clue us in on what kind of character this is. This is someone who wants to appear professional or rich, but who may not be. Perhaps he's trying to cover up his kind of poor status, right? And Brandon Sanderson does something similar in Mistborn. I don't have the exact line, so I'm paraphrasing, but he has a character who likes to talk about philosophy and scholarly things. But when we look closely at his library, we see that his book spines are very stiff and straight, and none of them have dog ears. There's no bookmarks or anything. So that tells us that this is a character who likes to talk and film, pretend to be scholarly, but who actually doesn't put in the work or research to be scholarly. So that's interesting too. So the modifiers are doing double duty. They're offering a description while providing valuable insight to the character. And this doesn't have to just be character related. It can offer insight to settings, themes, whatever else you can think of. So those are 5 good reasons to use adverbs and adjectives and when to use them. So hope that helps. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Get my latest writing tips at septembercfox.com. And see you later.